Good morning. I'm Jackie Peterson. Well, I came into MSIA in 1971. I was 21 years old, living in Berkeley, not looking for a spiritual teacher at all. Somebody brought me to seminars, and I just got this incredible sense after going to one seminar that if I went back, even once, I would be completely changed. My life would change. Everything would change. My values, everything that was important to me. I went back a couple days later to my second seminar, and I knew it was changed. I was fortunate to have a light study with John Roger just 3 months later in December of 1971. I'd never met him. I'd seen a tiny little school picture of him, and at that point I couldn't believe that that was him, that this straight guy. Understand, this is Berkeley in the 70s. Everybody had long hair, you know. We were all hippies, and we thought that any spiritual teacher would look like us with long hair and beards and everything. And J.R. was this little straight school teacher. But I went to his hotel in San Francisco, knocked on his door, and he opened it. And that was my first look at J.R. I sat down to have my first light study, and the first thing I did was pull out a pack of cigarettes and say, "You don't mind if I smoke?" He said, "Yes." I sat there and debated whether I would stay. If I could sit here and have this man read my beads for an hour without a cigarette. Well, obviously I decided to stay. We talked about what we were doing in MSIA, what MSIA was really about in that light study. And I argued with him, and he told me about getting off the wheel of reincarnation. And I said, "Well, I like it here. Can I come back if I want to?" And he said, "Yes." So I looked at him and said, "Okay, I'll do this." And that was my true agreement inside of me to work with the traveler. And that has never wavered. It's been an amazing journey. I had aura balances, and then I went to my first conference, the Conference of Love in 1972. I came down, and at that time, for somebody from Berkeley, LA was like this black hole of smog and conservative people, so it was very strange for me to be coming down here to go to a spiritual conference. But I did, and I had my third aura balance. I went into his house in Baldwin Park. And I went in and said, "J.R., I'm doing spiritual healing, and the group that I'm working with says that I need to be a minister, and they suggested I write away to Universal Life Church. But I figured I was doing this thing, so do you ordain people?" And he said, "Yes. Write down on a piece of paper what you're doing and why you want to be ordained." So before my aura balance, I grabbed a piece of paper and sat at his kitchen table and wrote down what I wanted what I was doing with a pencil. And at the end of my aura balance, just as they were circling with a crystal, J.R. walks in, rubbing his hands together. He goes, "Come on, we'll ordain you." And they brought me into the breezeway, which was J.R.'s study. It was a little space between his garage and his kitchen that had been closed off as his study. And it had that same blue chair in it. This is his home in Baldwin Park. And so he left, and then all the guys on staff filed in their turtlenecks and everything. And I remember, because it was a little bit lower and it seemed so big, all these guys coming in, and they gathered around me and ordained me. And it was recorded, thank goodness. And then they all left, and J.R. used to sit with us after an ordination, and we could just ask him anything or talk about anything we wanted. And the first thing that happened was a little bug was crawling on me. And J.R. said, and I went to take it off, to take it outside. And J.R. says, "Kill it." And I looked at him, and he goes, "Kill it." And I'm just looking at him in shock, and he says to me, "When a light bearer kills something, it progresses them." And that was news to me. First of all, that was okay. And second of all, that I was a light bearer. And it was really wonderful being called that. Then a little later in the conversation, I said to J.R., "I don't know what's going on. All of a sudden, I want to move to LA." Now remember, I didn't think a lot of LA. And J.R. said, "Do it." He says, "Do it now." He says, "Otherwise, 6 months from now, you'll be thinking, 'Oh yeah, I was going to do that.'" So I did. I went home to Berkeley and packed what I could fit in the car. I had a child, so it was mostly her things. figuring that all my stuff would follow me, that friends would bring it down. They had agreed to. But I just packed what I could fit in the car and moved to LA, found a place. So I moved in with a couple of other people, Penelope Bright, and we found a place in Pasadena and just settled in. Right around then, the Light Castle started. So I went to the open house party at the Light Castle, where I met a lot more MSIA people. I met Jim Peterson that day. Actually, I met his parents first and introduced myself because he was working nights and had slept in. About 4 years later, 2 years later actually, I married him when we'd moved into Prana. But the Light Castle, I don't know if you've heard about that. It was a house that Greg Stebbins rented with a few other people as a place for JR to have seminars. So he had seminars there, and then he also had seminars out at Kurt and Sandy Landon's in Canoga Park. And we would go to all the seminars. At that time, there were just 2 a week, so I went to every seminar JR ever had. During the Light Castle days, I worked early mornings to mid-afternoon, and Polly and Candy were both school teachers. By that year, I think 72, JR had stopped teaching.
What year did he stop teaching?
I think 71, 72 was his last year of teaching, so now we're probably into the fall of 72, and he was not. But Polly and Candy still were, and they were dying to quit. But I used to go in every afternoon and work with them. And it was fun because part of it was that I was the new person, and nobody knew that I was so close with Polly and Candy because I worked with them 5 days a week doing printing. We had Gestetner printers, and we printed all of JR's books and discourses and everything. Polly would do the discourses from tapes and type them up on masters and then print them on the Gestetners. So I would talk to other people, and they would tell me all the rumors about JR, or all the little stories. And I would bring them back to Polly and Candy, and they would sit in their chairs and just howl, and then, of course, go tell JR. So I would hear rumors like, he's really a breatharian, you know, he doesn't need food. And I would go in and go, this is what they said, and they would just laugh. So it was really great, because I was very close, so I always felt like I had, you know, like that close link with the Traveler, with John Roger as a person. He would come into the garage where we had our office for printing, and it was amazing. I mean, he could just walk in, walk over to the printer, pull out a sheet, and it would be the one sheet that was printed crooked. We did amazing work with it. The rep for the Gestetners used to come in and ask for samples of the work that we did, because we would do these 2- and 3-color books.
Describe what a Gestetner is.
A Gestetner is a mimeograph machine. It was used a lot in schools in those days, and it was, you know, what we could afford to print books on. One of the things that JR was always frugal. He would never let MSIA go into debt for anything. So if we couldn't afford something, then we didn't do it. Let me back up a minute. There was a great story I had when I first moved to LA. My first job was working with Ted Drake at Human Enterprises. And I worked in the office mostly, but sometimes I drove the truck. What we did at that time was we bought bulk and split it up and delivered it. When I first moved to LA, I moved into the house in Pasadena, and I worked down in, I'm thinking it was near JR, so it was near Baldwin Park. I don't remember exactly where it was. Might have been El Monte. But I worked in the office and with Ted, and what we did was we bought bulk items, like we would go to the farmer's market and buy big cases of lettuce and tomatoes and whatever people ordered. We had an order sheet, and then we would split it up and deliver it. Ted was saying that this was the future of groceries and, you know, buying, which of course we see is true today, but we were a little before our time. And I worked in the office, and one time I was on the phone with Michael's son taking the order for JR's house. And Michael pauses for a moment and comes back to the phone and says, JR wants to talk to you. Do you want to talk to him? So I was like, okay. So JR gets on the phone, and we'd been having seminars at the Light Castle at that time, so it was 1972, 73, and I was still pretty young and inexperienced with being around men with big egos and stuff, and there was someone who had been bothering me, and I didn't know what to do about it, and I didn't know how to respond. Well, I hadn't said anything to JR. I'd said something to one other person. JR gets on the phone with me, and he asks immediately about this man. And I said, yes, he was bothering me, but and that I didn't know how to handle it. And he was very specific with me. He said, do not be in a room alone with this man. Do not be in a room alone with one other woman. Be in a room with 2 other women or another man. It was such a relief for me to know how to handle that situation. And that's just an example of how JR just stayed so much in touch with us, all of us, and it was, how can I describe it? It was like he knew what was going on with all of us all the time, whether we said anything or not. So I wouldn't have any contact with JR sometimes for weeks or months at a time, but then when something would be off, he would show up. He would show up at a gas station, walking down the street, at a restaurant. He'd walk in to the office. I mean, in my experience of being in the movement in those days, it's like he was always there. He was always aware of what was going on. Another example is later on at Prana. We moved into Prana in August of 1974. And again, in those early days at Prana, he was there all the time. He was just in and out all the time. One time I was living in my room that had been selected for me by Polly and Candy, and I loved it, and I had all these plants, and I was very attached to all my plants. And JR stops me as I walk in the front door and says to me, and I looked at him and he says, did you get it? And I went, and he goes, blah, 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 blah. And he goes, now do you get it? And I looked at him and was like, I mean, he was speaking Greek. So we went a 3rd time to say it. And at that point, I could get a few words, that it was something about my room and something about the plants and something about a block. So that's basically what I said to him. And he looks at me and he goes, close enough. And he walks away. I immediately moved out of my room. Next time I ran into JR, he goes, so where are you living now? And I told him who I was living with, and he goes, misery loves company. Walked away again. I would say the most significant was coming into the movement, because everything else since then has been a straight and narrow.
Was in Berkeley then?
In Berkeley.
So what happened in Berkeley? Talk about that.
Well, that's what I already talked about.
So
meeting JR.
It was just that.
And having my light study. And then just knowing that I had to come down and be close to MSIA.
In what areas did you spend more of your time in Prana?
Lived at Prana for 5 years. So I would say living at Prana.
Were you there in the beginning to help it build?
Yes, I was one of the first residents.
Talk about that.
All right. So I was one of the first residents. I applied for Prana, and when the first rush came in of like everybody picking their rooms that first day, I hadn't been approved yet. And I didn't know why, but I wasn't too worried about it. So Polly and Candy selected a room for me because they were sure I was going to be there. Well, it turned out, unbeknownst to me, the reason I hadn't been accepted right away was that I didn't earn enough money to be sure that I could handle the expense of it. And one of the members of the steering committee, who happened to be Jim Peterson, who I later married, guaranteed my rent. I didn't know that till after we were married. So I was among the first people to move in. And here's a nice story. I moved all my things in, and then I went back up to Berkeley and spent a couple days with my parents. And I'd planned to spend about 4 days. But the second night, I woke up in the middle of the night, actually it was about 2 a.m., and with a voice in my ears, and it said, "It's clear now, you can go home." And I literally got up in the middle of the night, packed my baby into the car, and drove back to LA. And I found out that the night before had been the first meeting with John Roger of the Prana residents, and it had been quite a meeting. the rumors of it abound, but basically he really went through a lot of karma with people, and it was tough, and it lasted until about 2 a.m. when I woke up with that. And I was always a little disappointed that I'd missed it, but it was very obvious that I wasn't to be in that meeting.
Do you remember when JR would threaten people to cancel it, close it down because people weren't doing their part?
Yeah, but that never bothered me because I knew I was always doing my part.
I mean, can you talk about that?
Well, we would have these house meetings every week, and especially in the beginning, JR often came. And I mean, not every week, but he would just show up. And there was a lot of disturbance and turmoil in that first group that was there. There was a lot of us. I think there was over 80 residents stuffed into Prana at the time. And so we were like 2 and 3 to a room and things like that. So there was like a lot of energy and conflict. For instance, there was a woman there named Kathy Jeffries. So Kathy Jeffries was very confrontive. And this is just an example of how things were at Prana, but she also helped set a tone for Prana. She'd come from Synanon. Synanon was an alcohol and drug rehab program that was a live-in center, and it was extremely confrontive, where people would come in and do battle with their demons by doing battle with each other, and basically say anything and everything that came to mind, even if it seemed like a direct attack. Through these techniques, John Roger developed a thing called light circles, and we would do light circles at Prana. So it would be a time for being absolutely truthful and somewhat confrontive. I'll go back to Kathy in a minute, but just to give you an example of a light circle, we were doing them so often that one day I had my car broken into on the parking lot, the front parking lot of Prana. And I was really upset, and I called the police, and they told me it would be at least 2 hours before they came. So I was pacing around in the foyer and realized that there was a light circle going on in the small seminar room with JR. Now, to give you an idea of how common it was to have JR around at that time, there were only about a dozen or 15 people in this light circle, and it was open to anybody who walked in. So I walked in, and when it came to be my turn, I shared what was going on and that I had walked in simply because I was waiting for the police. JR looked at me and said, "And you're right where you belong." He says, "You do what you have to do with what's in front of you, and then you turn and you go and do the next thing." And it was such a confirmation for me for how to live my life. I never forgot that. But anyway, that was part of what Kathy brought in to the group. Kathy was incredibly confrontive and incredibly creative. And, you know, she would walk around Prana in like orange slippers and purple robe. I mean, it was like really hard sometimes to look at. And she seemed to be eternally grumpy. So Penelope and I mentioned Penelope right before we lived in Pasadena together, we made a pact that no matter what Kathy did, we were going to be so sweet. So there was nothing she could do to get us riled up, because she would go around and just try to rile people up. That was her fun.
So give us an example of what she would do.
She would go and just, she was very intuitive about figuring out what made people tick and where their buttons were. And she would just go and play tic-tac-toe on their buttons and get an emotional response. And she could keep things stirred up all the time.
Somehow she must have been correct about people's problems. So,
Absolutely
so
correct.
Talk about that.
Absolutely correct, which is why it would stir them up. You know, that she would come and say to me something about how I was raising my daughter, or, you know, that I had spent so much time down in the office, or I'm trying to think, or something wrong with the meal that I had cooked. I was often a cook. You know, or that I made bread so late, you know, and it was like things that I already would feel bad about, or, you know, would have a little thing. She would just be able to walk in and nail it, you know, and get people to respond, which was why I and Penelope developed this technique of dealing with her, of just absolutely being sweet, no matter what she did. Years later, I told her about it, and she laughed and she said, "And you were so sweet. You were sticky sweet." But she loved it, and we ended up becoming very close friends.
And did she run Prana? Was she the administrator?
No, not at all. Oh God, we would never put her in
But she had
position.
an interesting relationship with JR, constantly and sharing.
She always shared with JR, and she would always challenge him, and he loved being challenged. He
Do you
loved.
remember anything specifically in their repertoire?
No, I just have this image of her challenging him and yelling at him, and him just sitting back and laughing, and putting it right back on her, just putting it right back on her. That no matter what she could throw out, he could bring it in with loving. That he could counter her with loving, no matter what the deepest, darkest thing that she could come up with. And he loved the challenge, and she loved the challenge, and it was really fun to watch. Another one who used to do that was Kathleen O'Flynn. She would just come up and hit on him and hit on him and hit on him, and he would just sit back and take it and love it. Which reminds me of another story. In the early 80s, I got a call from a close friend who said to me, Wendell and Susan had left the movement. Well, that was just anathema. I couldn't believe that that would possibly occur. So when they hung up, I called Wendell and Susan's house. Wendell answered, and he said, yes, it had just occurred an hour or two before. And he said, I'm not going to tell you any stories, but we have decided to leave the movement. And that was it. About an hour later, I was sitting on my bed, and I started crying hysterically. I felt like my world had caved in. It's like something horrible had come over me, and I didn't know what to do about it. And it was like this gut-wrenching, emotional response of just all by myself, sitting on my bed, crying. When I finally got myself together, I called JR at Mandeville. I've always had his number. And he answered. And I was pregnant at the time with Danielle, my youngest child, so it was 1983. And he said to me that there was an energy, and that that things were going to get really rough, and that there was going to be a lot that was going to come down, and there were going to be a lot of rumors, and it was going to be very tough. And he said to me, you need to protect that child you're carrying. He said, so let it go past you. Don't talk to people. Ignore everything that goes on and just do your SEs. And that's what I did. And I pulled back from a lot of people in the movement because I didn't know who was what and where, and I refused to listen to any of the stories because I knew that my creative imagination would attach to the stories. And I knew that it was an energy because I had been hit with it so hard, just with the energy, with no story attached at all, and that it had been so devastating to me. But being buoyed by this brief conversation with John Roger, as the years went by, I just let the whole thing go past. Then, a few years later, I was working for Reuters, and at that point I was standing up and saying, I'm a part of this, as the things were hitting the newspapers. But then a big front page story was scheduled to come out in the LA Times, so I knew I had to read it. And I had, by then, avoided all stories for years. But I knew it was time, and so I sat down in the Sunday Times and read it because I knew there would be questions on Monday morning. So Monday morning, I walked into the office, and my closest friend there looks at me and says, so. And I looked at him and said, so. And he said, so I have one question. And I go, okay, go ahead. And he says, what's an aura balance?
Hello.
JR, you know how I love you. There is nothing in this world that I wouldn't do for you. Thank you.